Welcome to Real Wisdom, where we dive into the real stories of remarkable women. Today, I'm excited to introduce Ashton Applewhite. Ashton is a true champion for changing how we think about aging, and her journey is fascinating. She went from being afraid of getting older to becoming a leading voice and starting a movement. Her book, This Chair Rocks, a Manifesto Against Ageism, has opened eyes and hearts around the world. Ashton started on this path when she was 55, and her story shows us it's never too late to find your passion. So if you're ready to challenge what you think you know about getting older, you're in for a treat. And hey, if you want to hear more inspiring stories like Ashton's, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Hi, Ashton. I am so happy to have you here with me today. I know the topic of ageism has come up a lot recently, and you are a leading voice for sort of poking at the system and getting people to have a more challenging conversation around the topic of ageism. I'm really interested in your story, though, and how you went from realizing that ageism is something that happens to other people, but now is starting to happen to you. Do you remember that moment?
Well, I think it was less about ageism happening as aging. Um, there wasn't, I'm fortunate enough to have been self-employed for a long time. So I didn't, there wasn't a moment where I realized the door was shutting in my face because of my age. But I looked in the mirror and went, oh, it's happening to me. And I have to say, it's hard we age slowly, and I think the resistance is a little bit just human. We sort of, as a kid, you can't imagine, why would you sit down when you could run everywhere, right? It's
Mhm.
hard. Humans are bad at imagining the future. And I think a little bit also because we're apprehensive about it, we think, oh, that's something that happens to other people. But haha, it happens to all of us. And when I was in my mid 50s, when I realized, like, oh, I'm not going to be the only human who does not get and look older over time. And I realized how apprehensive I was, just this vague sort of free floating anxiety about it. I mean, I wouldn't say dread, but I wasn't feeling good about it. And I thought, why is that? What's it? I'm nerdy. I'm fact-based. I'm very, very careful about my sources and the quality of the research that I cite. So I thought, why don't I do some digging? And I started researching longevity and interviewing people over 80. And in a matter of months, and I've been at this now, gosh, almost 20 years, I realized, honestly, this is no exaggeration, that everything I thought I knew about what it was like to grow old was flat out wrong, or not nuanced enough, or way too negative, and just like not an accurate portrayal. So I got a big B in my bonnet about why we don't know these things, why we only see the negative, scary stuff about aging, which is real. You are not going to hear me saying, oh, just, do enough push-ups, eat enough kale, it's all going to be great. There's plenty to, to be apprehensive about, but those fears are fed by the society in which we live. So my work is an encouragement to people to zoom out and look at where all those messages come from and what purpose they serve, because they do not serve our best interests individually or collectively.
From reading your book, my eyes have really been opened to the topic of ageism.
Thank
And
you.
I think I understand what it is. But can you give anybody who is watching a brief description of ageism and how it really impacts our well being?
It would take me 300 pages to describe how all the ways in which it affects us, and it affects each of us differently, depending on our circumstances, of course, and our own, where we are in our lives and what we're up against, etc. But let me define it as the dictionary definition is prejudice and stereotyping on the basis of age. We are being ageist. Anytime we make an assumption about someone or a group of people based on how old we think they are. And we all do this all the time. We are all ageist. Every time you have that itch to know, how old is someone? Oh, your friend is seeing someone new. Oh, how old are they? Why do we need to know? We need to know partly because it's human curiosity and because it helps us categorize, but also the minute we have a number, all sorts of assumptions click into place. Not because we're bad people, just because, that's how our minds work. And because we live in a culture that barrages us from childhood on, starting with Disney movies, and children's books of certain ways to be old, and how terrible it will be to encounter any kind of incapacity. Those messages become part of our identity unless we stop to challenge them. So we are all biased, and this shapes our um, this shapes our self-perception in ways that are enormously damaging. I mean, give me a domain and I'll give you lots of examples.
It was really interesting because I started reading the book over the weekend. Here's my copy of it. This Chair Rocks, a Manifesto Against Ageism. So I started reading this over the weekend. I've made several notations, but the thing was, and I noticed it because I was at this event and I was talking to a woman that was younger than I was. And I did it myself. I asked her how old she was, and it
Yeah.
had nothing to do with anything that we were discussing. And afterwards, I'm thinking, and then it was like I couldn't stop my mouth because then it was like, wow, you look really young for being here. Why do we do that? Why?
Well,
I don't know.
I appreciate you telling that story on yourself, Holly. And it's a beautiful story because the most important, absolutely necessary first step in all social change is awareness, right? Most bias is unconscious. We can't change something we're not aware of, right? And ageism is much less examined than other forms of prejudice. So I will say, there's all these aha moments like that the minute we start to see it. So just by catching yourself doing that and asking why, don't be hard on yourself. Why did you do it? Because you're a human, who grew up in the 20th century in the West, the 21st century. You're a product of your environment and your times. We all are. We are all ageist, but we are used to thinking that we live in a very age segregated society, right? And so we tend to think that what we have in common with people has to do with the fact that they are around the same age as we are. And of course, there are cultural reference points that are a function of when you were born, but age plays a much, much smaller role in defining what we're interested in and what we're good at than we think it does. But we love to classify, so that's why, and we make these assumptions. But what you did is just so important. The very most important step is to look at our own attitudes towards age and aging. When, someone says, how old are you? It's awkward. It's a little clunky to say socially, but what I feel like saying sometimes is like, I'm happy to tell you, I'm 72, but I want to know why you need to know, why you think you need to know, not in a gotcha kind of way, but what itch? Just the question you just asked yourself. What itch does that scratch? Where does the itch come from? And what ideas and assumptions click into place? No judgment. We have a number.
On the cover of your book, there is a blurb from the Washington Post, and it said that this is one of the 100 best books to read at every age. Why would a woman, and I'm just thinking of it from my own point of view, why would a woman in midlife find this book useful?
Well, I would love your answer to that after mine. There's a phrase in the book that I appropriated from a geriatrician named Joanne Lynn. And early on, I knew I was onto something, but I didn't know what. And it took a number of really very uncomfortable years to figure out what it was that I wanted to say. But she called herself an old person in training. And because I wasn't ready yet to identify as an old person or an older person, but I was like, oh, that's what I have become. So I would make a more general case. I'm delighted to talk about the gendered nature of aging because it is different and harder for women to age in Western society. But I would say that to become an old person in training is simply to acknowledge that someday, if you're lucky, you're going to get old, because ageism takes root in denial. Like, that's never going to happen to me. Old people are different from me and typically lesser and other, right? All prejudice takes root in othering another group, right? They're different from me and therefore usually lesser in some way or less deserving of equal respect and treatment. And if you become an old person in training, it's just to acknowledge you will someday become an older person. And that older you can be as far off on the horizon as you need her to be. It's hard to see ourselves getting older. But once you make that sort of mental leap and start looking at the older people around you instead of past us, right? And think, oh, I hope I don't do that when I get older, or that person has a really good strategy, or I like the way they do a certain thing, then it makes a connection to your future self. And it's much easier not to get on this punishing, expensive, fruitless hamster wheel of age denial. So I would say the earlier a person becomes an old person in training, and reading my book is certainly a good way to do so, the better off they are. But it's better. I was sort of irked, full disclosure, at the Washington Post because they did a list of 100 books, and they put mine as a book to read in your 90s. Better to read it in your 90s than not at all. But honest to God, the earlier in life you get the memo that aging is not something to be feared. Loss of capacity, yes. Loss of people you love, yes. Those are all fearsome losses, but they don't happen linked to a given chronological age. They affect us in different ages. Some people are born disabled, right? Lots of people don't lose any mental capacity, etc. So the sooner we start looking at older people, really looking at them instead of past them or thinking, ew, it's scary, it's icky, I don't want to go there, the less fear it holds. I mean, there's actually a study, the AARP did a study. The more we know about aging, the less fear it holds. In part because our fears are so built up, but also just because it's interesting, and looking at what scares us, it's never as scary as we think it's going to be. And there's a lot of good stuff about aging that doesn't get talked about.
Yes, yes. And I completely agree with you. And I think that's why I find this topic so fascinating. And especially right now at this point in my life, a lot of the women that I talk to within our community, aging is terrifying for them. And a lot of it is centered around another topic that I feel is very relatable, is menopause. And women are going through menopause. And then I also feel that that makes them question themselves and how they see themselves, because all of a sudden they have another label placed on them. And it's hard.
Aging is hard, and it is harder for women for a number of reasons. I'm going to throw a big word out here: patriarchy. Under patriarchy, women's value is linked to our reproductive status. Globally speaking, but we stop researching health issues for women over 55 because we're no longer reproductively useful. That's wrong. It's biased. It's sexist. It's misogynist. It's not okay. We all know that women continue to contribute in 1,000 million beautiful and valuable ways well past menopause. So the anxiety is real, but I see enormous reason for optimism on so many fronts. One being that, when my mother went through menopause, no one talked about menopause. No one talked to me about menopause. And there are a lot of conversations emerging now. And I see you nodding. I bet you see that. There are all kinds of women's groups. There are all kinds of books. There are all kinds of therapies, which is enormous progress. Because once again, if you bring the scary thing out of the dark and discover that, it's something we can talk about and learn about and treat if it's a medical problem and normalize, hopefully also not pathologize. That's another thing. I mean, when normal biological transitions are pathologized, like changes in hormone level, and I'm not a doctor, and I'm not for an instant saying, oh, no one should treat anything. Go to a doctor and figure out how to get through it. Some people have easy menopauses. Some people, go through hell. But just airing the conversation normalizes it and destigmatizes it. So that is enormous progress.
It truly is. And, back in 2009, I had started a community for women in menopause because I was going through it. And it doesn't feel like it was that long ago, 2009, but nobody was talking about it at all then. So I agree. We have definitely come a long way in getting women to talk about an issue that at times, like you said, your mom, my mom, they were not going to mention hormones
And the
in
reason,
public.
right, and the reason is because of the loss of social economic, status and value when if we are linked to, whether or not we can have babies, which is, think of all the women who are infertile, think of all the transgender people who aren't, it reduces the value of family to people to whom we are biologically related, which is really impoverished. I think of my family, and of course I'm aware of, my I do have 2 kids, etc. But I also believe very strongly, and it's there in the book, cast a wide net, right? And this is a huge advantage that women have. Aging is gendered, and it's harder for women because our attractiveness is yoked not only to our reproductive capacity, but to our conventional air quotes around attractiveness. Are we thin? Are we white? Are we blonde? And so on, right? Look at where we've come. Another reason to be optimistic is think how far we've come around the body acceptance movement. We still have a way to go. But one reason fatness is so scorned is because it's profitable. The diet industry makes millions off, diet regimens. The beauty industry makes billions. The anti-aging piece of it, convincing women that wrinkles are the worst thing ever to happen. You're going to get wrinkles, right? And no judgment. I am really, really, I really mean this. I do not say anything anymore about women's appearances, period, because aging is tough and we need to go through this in our own way at our own time. I got a early course correction. I was giving a talk in Beverly Hills to all women and talking with the moderator beforehand about how to do the Q&A. And I said brightly, well, we could have the women say how old they are when they ask a question. And without skipping a beat, she said, honey, this is Beverly Hills. Do you want me to have ambulances outside? I was like, okay, got it. I have learned to be better at meeting people where they are, but I was a little judgier about coloring your hair and fudging your age. And a woman came up to me. She was gracious enough to do it privately. She said, you don't get it. If I didn't dye my hair, my boss would realize how old I am and I have children to support. And I was like, got it. And I did. So we each need to make the accommodations that we make. But I think one thing for sure, women are harsher critics of each other's appearance than men are. If a woman starts to go gray, it is almost always her female friends who say, Louise, you sure about that? Why do we do that? We do it not because we're bad people or bad friends. We do it because we live in a sexist, capitalist patriarchy where voices have been telling us since we were kids to conform to this punishing and impossible norm that divides us and punishes everyone who can't achieve it, which is most people. And the people who are, like super thin, white, and blonde, are miserable.
Well, because they have to feel the pressure of maintaining that appearance constantly.
Absolutely.
And I'm really glad you brought up the diet and the healthcare industry because that's how I learned about you. I was talking to a woman named Deb Benfield, and she mentioned you and said, really great things about you. And that's when I became so curious about what you're saying. But that was one of the comments she made was that we find ourselves caught up in that trap, especially women, of losing weight and then it doesn't work. And then you try another diet. And it's just this constant, hamster wheel that we find ourselves on.
Or plastic surgery. And again, no judgment, but you have a little plumper, a little filler, and anytime, I don't know who said this, probably the Buddha, but if we are always trying to achieve happiness and fulfillment according to what we look like or how many clothes we have in our closet or cars in our garage, it is not a source of inner peace in the long run.
Well, speaking of happiness, you mentioned in the book the U-shaped happiness curve, and I think I'm, down in the valley.
Rough. We're in the trough.
Can you just explain that a little bit? Because I found it really fascinating that we're happiest at our earliest age and our oldest
Yeah.
age, and that's very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it seems that, there were just so many like aha moments when that I had no idea. And when I encountered, it's called the U curve of happiness. Go ahead and Google it. My mother-in-law was always like, I don't believe it. And I would say, well, thank you, Ruth, for taking issue with the best, substantiated statistic. And I will say that additional research has come out saying, gee, maybe it's not quite so unequivocal and happiness is hard to measure. And I do worry that if we don't get better at supporting very old people in having the end of life and the deaths, frankly, that they
Mhm.
would like to have, it could drop off. But abundant data shows that people are happiest in the beginnings of their lives and at the end. And it is a function of the way aging itself affects the healthy brain. Kids live in the moment because they don't have the cognitive, whatever, to live any other way. They don't see the future yet. And older people live in the moment because we know that time is short. I thought going into this, I was so skeptical. I thought, well, everything's going to be awful. And one of the things that will make it awful is this awareness. I had this like vision of the shadow of the grim reaper, stretching across the sad iron bedstead where the terrified old person, was, dreading death. It doesn't work that way. The knowledge that time is short makes us spend it more wisely and with people we care about and makes us appreciate the moment. Older people don't want to die, and they especially don't want to die in pain, but we become less fearful of it and less attached to it. We get better at not sweating the small stuff. And all those things do help contribute to happiness with our present day situation.
I'm sure that you've probably uncovered some interesting myths along the way, and I read about a few of them in the book. But is there one that really stands out to you that you were really shocked that that was something we truly believed about the way we age?
Well, I would say it's not so much a myth as a stereotype. The stereotype that bothered me the most, which I simply hadn't occurred to me until I started learning about longevity, was this idea that old people are alike. That at a certain point we just, people are always like, when does age begin? When do we cross that, that river, that velvet rope and end up old where everything is awful? And of course, there's no such thing because we age in relation to others. But I sometimes feel like if I could put one fact in everyone's mind, it is the fact that the longer we live, the more different from each other we become. Every newborn is unique, but 17-year-olds have way more in common developmentally, socially, physically than 37-year-olds, and so on out. So any generalization about a group of people is wrong. Fat people, black people, left-handed people, they're all stereotypes and they're all, of course, misguided, but it is especially ill-informed to generalize about people on the basis of age, and the older the person, the less that number reveals about them. And this is not some conjecture of mine. This is science, right? We are shaped. We may be in great shape cognitively, but be immobilized physically, right? It's just you might have a physical injury. I have arthritis and I had a total shoulder replacement. If I were a tennis player, that would have been devastating. I'm not a tennis player, or you see what I mean? It's just like
Yes.
it depends on your network of friends, on your socioeconomic status, on your temperament. So, so I would say the idea that at some point we become the elderly, or that this idea that people in a senior community are all alike, they can range in age by 40 years. You can have people from 50 to 90 who are way, way, way more diverse more
Mhm.
different from each other in every imaginable way. They might be the same socioeconomic class, right, if they live in the same place. But in terms of their physical and cognitive function, they are way more different than a group of people from age 10 to age 50. And so that, I'd like people to understand that and just understand that making an assumption on the basis of age, especially about an older person, is just really factually um, dumb.
When we talk about aging as something that we need to fix, and I think part of that is because when you turn on the television or the radio or open a magazine, everything is geared towards avoiding looking older. But you say that it's not something that we need to fix, that this is a process that we go through.
Teaching is not right. It's not a problem. I mean, another common assumption is that aging is something sad and icky that old people do.
Yeah.
And we are aging from the minute we are born. It's what makes it so interesting. If you had told me 20 years ago I would be fascinated by aging, I would have said, ew, why do I want to think about something sad and depressing? It is how we move through life. It touches on every domain of study except maybe like pure math, but philosophy, economics, literature, sociology, you name it, right? It's in there. It affects us. That's why this conversation can go in so many different directions. And it affects every aspect of being human. So it's fascinating. And in gerontology, which is the study of old age. And by the way, I'm not a geriatrician, not a gerontologist. I knew none of this going in. So all this information is really available, at the top of the internet, more and more to any of us. If we embrace a broader and more accurate view of what aging actually is. Aging is not dying. There are people who are like, ooh, old people are icky and ageism isn't important because we're going to die and we don't want to think about that. Older people are closer to death. That's for sure. And that is one sort of reason for aversion. But dying is a discrete biological event that happens at the end of all this living. People may look at me and think I'm ancient, but they don't look at me and think I'm dying. So that's not an excuse. It's not a reason to avoid dealing with aging or age bias. And death is another thing. It's hard to talk about, but if you talk about it and what you might want, it defangs it, right? It sets the stage for ongoing conversations about what you think you might want, which is going to change over time.
Have you done anything intentionally in your life now that you've learned more and more about the aging process? Have you done something differently to make it a better experience for yourself?
I think, I do say, I will give you $1 if you say my book is fun to read because I think it's very dense, but I hope it's fun to read. I do say that you can't read my book without feeling better about the years ahead. She's nodding, folks. She's nodding.
Yes.
Um, and so I would say that what I have done is to learn a lot about aging, which is really just to see how many of our fears are based in myths and stereotypes. And also again, a lot of the fears are real. The people I've loved all my life, that's really the most awful prospect. Some of them are going to die.
Mhm.
But part of what I have done, which, maybe I would have done anyway, but is to cultivate a group of friends who are also younger, who are going to outlive me. And I'm not hoping I get dead, and I'm really dreading the death of close friends, but that is a comfort and an insurance against that loss. So that's a very practical answer. But I would say the bigger answer is just to sort of understand all the forces, economic, social, personal, that shape or attempt to shape the way we age and see which of them are operating in my personal best interest and our collective best interest, and which of them, like like all the focus on women's appearance, are really detrimental to our individual and collective well-being. Because once you see that, you're like, then you get, at least me, I get, angry, I get pissed off. I stop drinking the Kool-Aid.
Yeah, but there's so many women that are afraid of stopping the
Absolutely.
Kool-Aid because they look in the mirror and they're thinking, "Oh, I need to do something for this wrinkle, or I need to do this, or people aren't going to accept me or take me seriously or recognize me." You feel that.
Those fears are real.
Yeah.
Those fears are real. I want to mention a website called Old School, which is oldschool.info. And it is I started it with two colleagues in 2018, and we're about to transition into a hub, which is really exciting, but that's not going to happen for a couple weeks. But check it out. It started as a repository of all the best resources about ageism because I thought this movement is new. Isn't it cool? It wouldn't it be great if people could find solid,
Yeah.
material in one place. And we also started creating our own guides, and we have written guides. They're free downloads. One is called Who Me Ageist, which is some ways to start looking at your own internalized ageism. So like, that thing where you talked about like, oh wait, it's in me. You're right. That's where it starts, is looking at your own bias. And another is called Ageist, Sexist, Who Me, which is about how ageism and sexism combine and inform women's experience of aging. Although, it all affects men and, it affects all genders. So the way we as women can come together is to talk about this stuff. That's what consciousness raising did in the 70s. Women came together and compared notes about not getting heard or getting harassed. And when they, in a safe space, right, where stayed in the room and realized like, oh, it's not just me. It's not because my boss is a jerk or whatever. It's not my fault. It is a function of the society in which we live. It's a collective problem. And that means we can come together and do something about it. So, something you are already doing with this work, but your women listeners could do, is come together, ideally with women of all ages, and talk about this stuff. Because the minute we talk about it, we see, we are, if they're all ages, we are reminded, we older women, of how being young is hard. Would you really go back in time to your younger womanhood?
Oh, no.
Oh no,
No.
right? Well, if aging is so awful, how come none of us want to be any younger? And younger women would see the way aging is a source of power and confidence for women. So go to oldschool.info and
Okay.
search under sexist, and you'll see the guide. Download it. It's how to start a consciousness raising group. You don't have to start a group, but it has really good conversation starters at the end of it. And bring some friends together and just start talking and comparing notes, because that will help you see what we're all up against collectively.
You mentioned that part of what you're doing is having friends of all ages, mixing up the generations. A couple of months ago, I interviewed, and I think you might know her, and her name is Sky Bergman, and she did this really wonderful documentary, and now she has a book, Lives Well Lived. And that was one of the things that she really encouraged and said it was so important for us to have friends and to know and interact with people of all generations. Is that something that you obviously really believe in yourself?
Absolutely. And here's an ask. Another habit that's hard to break. Try to let go of the word generation and
Okay,
just talk about all ages.
all ages.
Because the idea of a generation is, there's no scientific basis for it, except in the sense that your children are another generation and your parents are another generation. Otherwise, it's just a catch-all phrase that marketers and demographers love, that the meaning of which is that the millions and millions of people born roughly around the same time, no one even agrees on how long a generation, air quotes, is, right? But that the minute we use those terms, we fall for the idea that everyone born roughly around the same time is alike, and nothing could be further from the truth. So something your listeners and watchers might want to think about, and again, no judgment, but think about when you show up at a meeting or a social gathering, do you make a beeline for people your own age?
Yes.
We all do, right? We all do. But that is a little habit that we can break. And you may go over, and it can be hard. I mean, I think, for older people, we're so brainwashed by this idea that we're that young people won't want to talk to us or will think we're, ugly or uninteresting or whatever. And it's like you have to screw up your courage a little bit. Screw up your courage a little bit. That young person might be an idiot, but not all young people are idiots, right? You may or may not enjoy talking to them, but it's not their age that's going to make them jerks, right? It's not their
Yes.
age that's going to make us establish. And you will, if you're having a party, try and invite people who are where there's an age range, and ideally also a range of ethnicities, a range of nationalities, because the more, and it's, you have to be conscious about it, and it's awkward. It's not easy, but this is how trust and social change happens slowly at the pace of one relationship at a time. We don't see it at first. I had a really mortifying moment where I wanted to convene a group, blah, 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 and it wasn't, and we got over 100 people to show up at a Zoom, and it wasn't till a Black friend who came and she said, "Where's the diversity?" And I had not even noticed that almost every face was white. It's really hard not to center whiteness when we've been surrounded by it. But honest to God, I was super grateful she said something. And I have tried to do better, and doing better makes me feel a lot better.
Right, right. But like you say, you don't necessarily do it intentionally, but that's
No,
how you envisioned your life and your surroundings.
absolutely. And it's really hard to see it. And it's habit. Bias is deeply ingrained habits. And it's really hard to change habits. Now, I mean, and I don't mean to be like the language police, because language is subjective. We're all going to use the terms we use. But now you'll find the word generation, coming up all the time. Just say age group, or
Yes.
say
Yeah.
older people or younger people, right? Because categorizing people by age is never a good idea.
Yes. Well, speaking of younger people, is it okay if I read a quote from the book?
Uh, Delighted. Then
Okay.
I let those words talk instead of my mouth.
There's a quote in here that says, um, it's in the older brain section. Younger people think happiness occurs because of things, but when they're older, people know that happiness occurs in spite of things.
Mm, good
And
one, Holly. You
that
really,
really struck a chord with me.
yeah. I mean, it's, we live in this very um, competitive, um, capitalist society where you're supposed to work, you're supposed to be productive, you're supposed to be active, you're supposed to have a job. And we, some or all of those things change over time. Sometimes, ideally, if we, it helps to acknowledge that, which is often not, and some of these changes are not welcome. But if we can see them coming or prepare for their possibility, become an old person in training, so on, it's easier to adapt. And the fact is that we age well by adapting, not by denying. I can't think of how many, people in middle age are like, well, I drive, I run, I do all these things. I'm, not aging. Well, you already aren't running as fast as you did when you were 20. You aren't seeing as well as you did when you were 30, whatever. That's life. And to see that that's a really, really important point, that we age well by adapting and not by pretending none of this is going to happen to us.
You're right. My body is not the same as it was when I was 30 and 40.
Right.
But
But also you're going to have, it doesn't, we live also in a very ableist society, which is to say there's a lot of prejudice and stigma around the loss of physical and mental capacity. So when we see someone walking with a cane or who can't, who has a disability, we jump to the assumption that their quality of life must be terrible. And people with disabilities will assure you that that is not the case, right? We tend to devalue older people and people with disabilities because we are ageist and because we are ableist, when the lived experience is very different. That's an idea in the book, that the bull looks different. It was a phrase that I heard from a ethicist at Johns Hopkins. I went on a journalist trip, and he said his mantra was a Mexican saying, he's working with older people, that the appearance of the bull changes when you enter the ring. Looks different to the matador. And I went, that's a big idea. Let me think about that. And it became really important. I shortened it to the bull looks different. And psychologists call it the psychologist's fallacy. We cannot ever know what another person is experiencing, right? And because we are biased, because we are all conditioned to think that being old is less good than being young, and having any kind of disability is less good than being non-disabled, we look at it and we assume that their quality of life must be terrible. I mean, disabled people are some of the most interesting, compassionate, fascinating people in the world. They are really ingenious, and they have learned to be interdependent in really interesting ways. And I mean, I'm not saying that it's great to be, not be able to move or to feel chronically tired all the time. That's not the point. But they have adapted in really interesting ways. And they say, I am who I am. This has been a shift over the last 30, 40 years. Older people tend to say, I am who I am despite being blind, despite, my disability. And the culture has changed to be more accepting and acknowledging of impairment in a way that is so much more humane and realistic. And younger people with disabilities tend to say, I am who I am because of it. It is part of who makes me me. And please do not make assumptions about my life, my identity, my values, my value on the basis of what you see without talking to me and finding out what it's actually like for me.
That is really eye-opening. And I think before reading your book and coming across your message, I had a different outlook on things. And I think more women, because I'm only speaking from my community, really could benefit from your message. If we want to continue this conversation and be a part of talking about ageism and having a more positive outlook on life, what's the best way to stay connected with you and to explore this topic more?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Well, as I mentioned, you can go to oldschool.info
Mm-hmm.
and you can download that Ageist Sexist Who Me guide for some ways to think about it and bring your own friends and colleagues together, whether in person or virtually. We at Old School are in the self-appointed business of bringing people together to talk about these things. We have a weekly meetup open to anyone. It happens on and if you go to oldschool.info, you'll see the link where there's an events page. Every Wednesday at 1:30 p.m. ET, open to anyone. Ask us anything about ageism. Just come and listen. Identify yourself. Don't identify yourself. But it's a safe space to talk about these issues. And a group of really nice regulars has emerged. And we also host gatherings. And if you follow me on social media, I'm at This Chair Rocks. I'm really easy to find. I'm the only person with my weird name in the world. I have a Facebook page. I have an account on Twitter. I have an Instagram account. It is becoming increasingly easy to find other people who are interested in this stuff. My website is thischairrocks.com. My book is not free, but I have been thinking out loud on the blog on that page, thischairrocks.com/blog. So if you doubt anything I've said or want to learn more about it, go to the blog. It's searchable by topic. Go to oldschool.info. It's searchable by topic, and educate yourself. And you'll find me every Wednesday at 1:30 at office hours.
Thank you so much for joining me today. And this was really a great conversation. And I am so glad that you are getting this message out into the world.
Thank you, Holly. I appreciate you doing more than your part to do the same.
Thank you for joining us on Real Wisdom. If you're inspired by stories like this and want to be a part of a community that celebrates the wisdom of women, visit joinempart.com and become a part of our conversation. And don't forget to subscribe for even more real wisdom. Until next time, keep embracing your story.